Welcome back. Richard, it's good to see you're in a very different place today.
I'm in a different location. I am.
Yes, we are recording on, well, the day after Thanksgiving, so Black Friday, we're recording, and you went away to visit family.
I did Washington, D.C., family here, and decided to take the risk of traveling on the busiest travel days of the year. But I have to say, the airports got it down. They were fully staffed, and everything went without a hitch, despite the crowds. I mean, I can't say enough about how the TSA and the airlines, everybody was cooperating. So it was an uneventful journey and very easy to do. So despite all the traffic, everything went well.
That's great. That's great. And hopefully your return trip will be equally smooth, and you'll be able to be back at work first thing next week.
Looking forward to that. Yep.
Yeah. So today we are actually not going to talk about Thanksgiving or Black Friday or even the holidays that are coming up. We're going to talk about mental health, sort of in this general sense, because there was this recent article that was published in Time that really caught our attention and deserves some focus as we in a podcast today.
Right. Yeah. The title of the article sort of captures the entire issue. The title is "America Has Reached Peak Therapy," and then the next, "Why is our mental health getting worse?" And that certainly got our attention. Guilty as charged. Are we really getting worse? And the article implies that our current approaches, psychiatry and psychology, might be failing our patients. And so the question is, are we really failing patients? And there's a wonderful line in this article, and I'll quote it. It said, "It isn't only that demand is outpacing supply, it's that the supply was never very good to begin with, leaning on therapies and medications that only skim the surface of a vast ocean of need." And that's sort of hit us because there are really two issues embedded in that sentence. One is, and the first one that caught my attention, was the supply was never very good to begin with, which is sort of a scathing criticism of the entire institution. And then the other issue is a vast ocean of need that apparently we as mental health professionals are not addressing. Okay. So it raises two issues, and we kind of want to talk about these two issues as we go through this. One is, what is my responsibility as a mental health professional?
Right.
And we have to have the courage to be self-critical.
Right.
We have to say, am I doing a good job? And also, we need to be a learning organization. We need to learn from our mistakes. And if we're falling short or we're making mistakes, we need to learn from those and do better.
Absolutely.
So there's responsibilities that we have as individual therapists doing our work each day. There's a second issue that's in this article, and that is there some societal responsibility? Do we have some larger responsibility? And is mental health, like cigarettes and automobile safety and food safety, is it a societal issue that we should be providing safety to large numbers, maybe to the entire country? And then the second issue in there is, can we make individuals healthy in a culture that isn't healthy? You think of the homeless, you think of the unemployed, the underemployed, the marginalized, and you think, well, is our culture, do we live in a healthy culture? And if you don't live in a healthy culture, can you then expect to make individuals healthy? And I think that's an important question. We talk a lot about divisiveness and anger and groups. There's a great deal of racial, religious, ethnic hatred around right now. And if you have an angry society, can you make individuals happy when they're living in an angry society?
Absolutely. And so, and to even, think about that, we could just look at some of these statistics, which is which are
Right.
pretty staggering. But, right now, and keep in mind that these statistics really are only focusing on people who are insured, because insurance companies gather data, and then
Right.
that data is then used to kind of get some of this information. And so this doesn't include people who aren't insured, and certainly doesn't include people who don't seek treatment. But 1 in 8 adults in the United States are on antidepressants.
Right.
And antidepressants are used to treat depression, of course, and anxiety. But 1 in 8 adults, U.S. adults, are on antidepressants. 20% of people receive some kind of mental health care. Now, we've talked for a long time about 20%, and that there's this need, or this sort of statistically about 20% of people at any given time probably meet criteria for a mental health condition. But if we're only talking about this particular subset of the population that have insurance and that are seeking treatment, health treatment, and that's 20%, we'd have to assume that there's a far greater number of people who actually need mental health treatment.
Bernie, in our community alone, many of the people who are receiving treatment are not insured,
right?
Because the practices don't accept insurance,
right?
So they're not counted,
right?
And hundreds of patients who are not being counted here,
right? In our area alone, which is a moderate size, medium size, closer to small size area in Central Florida, most of the psychiatrists in our area do not take insurance.
They don't take insurance, exactly.
So none of their patients would be captured by these statistics.
Right. So these are minimum numbers.
Right. On they're definitely on the more conservative end. And and the access, while access to mental health services has increased, there's a significantly higher portion of people seeking mental health treatment than they did, a decade ago or so. Right. The rates and prevalence of mental health conditions continues to significantly increase.
Right.
Suicide rates are up 30% since in the last 2 decades. Right. So since 2000, suicide rates have increased by 30%.
Right.
We just talked about 20% of people have some kind of mental health, are getting some kind of mental health care, but 30% of adults in surveys, 30% of adults report depression and anxiety.
That's right. And that's that minimum number again. 20% are reported, but there are vast numbers who are not being reported. So it's probably much larger than 20%, much greater than 20%.
Right. So the bottom line with this is that there is a large portion of our population that have mental health needs, that vast ocean that the author was talking about. And while we are, he mentioned that the supply doesn't meet the demand, we have a huge number of people who need mental health support and services. Yet the availability of support services and mental health treatment continues to lag behind the need. And so, that problem is apparent, that there's just not enough supply to meet the demand.
Yeah, there's like 8,000, we're like 8,000 therapists short. We can't even begin to meet the demand that's out there. So again, there's those two issues of what we're doing may not be very effective, but also we're not reaching vast numbers of patients who are seeking mental health help. Okay?
Right. Absolutely.
So we know that demand far outpaces supply. And we're not sure about whether what we're doing is effective or not. So what are the problems we know? Well, there are two. One is there's a problem in making a diagnosis. Right. And second, there's a problem of intervention. And of course, the first person we think about is Dr. Silver. Right. When because he famously said over and over again, if you don't have the right diagnosis, it doesn't matter what the treatment is. Right. Okay. And so with problem number one is diagnosis. The problem with mental health, and we've talked about this before, unlike physical illness, there are no biomarkers. There are no lab tests that we can give for mental illness. There's no test for dyslexia. There's no test for depression. There isn't a single biomarker that says you have this or that illness. And mental health illnesses are not either or. They're not black and white. It's like you either have it or you don't have it. You're either depressed or you're not depressed. Now, for insurance purposes or for billing purposes, you can say, yes, you have depression, or no, you don't have depression. But in the real world, that's not how these work. It's not an either or.
Right. You know, one of the things that we often say when we do workshops and when we're teaching about mental health conditions is that most symptoms, most characteristics of mental illness, mental health problems, many of those symptoms are perfectly normal and natural at some times. You know, it is perfectly normal to be depressed when you've lost a loved one, or when you're going through significant stressors in your life. It's, you know, it's perfectly normal when, you know, you're coming off of anesthesia after a surgery. It's perfectly normal for some people to have hallucinations.
Right.
So it's, you know, so there are times when you can, you know, sometimes the most serious mental health symptoms that you can think of, whether it's hallucinations or delusions or suicidal depression or those kinds of things, there are times when it's not surprising or not unusual for someone to experience those symptoms. And so you're right, it's not either you have it or you don't have it. It's at, do you have it at a level in a situation that causes functional impairment?
Right, that's
We
right.
talked about that many times before.
Right. And in our field, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is based on symptoms. You know, of these symptoms and what's the likelihood that you have the diagnosis. But remember, we're always talking about symptoms. And it may not be sufficient to treat a person's symptoms. It may be that there's a problem beyond just the symptom presentation, because what people are talking about now is what's causing the symptoms. Yes, you have these symptoms, but what's causing the symptoms? Why are you depressing? William Glasser used to say, you're not depressed, you're depressing for some reason, okay? And we have to get to the reason. And so it raises the question of, do I have a mental illness or do I have a life problem? You know, maybe my problem is I'm stubbing my toe on a life problem at work or at home, and I don't really have a mental illness. It's just a life problem. So we can't, if we just treat symptoms, are we doing enough for our patients? And the other question is, if the diagnosis is inaccurate, if I make the wrong diagnosis, it doesn't matter what intervention I do. It's not going to work because I've got the wrong diagnosis.
Absolutely. And we see this, you know, very often here in our office. And it brings to mind a patient that I saw a couple of days ago where, you know, he struggles with ADHD symptoms and some depressive anxiety symptoms. And he's on medication, and we keep talking about how the medication isn't working. It's not doing what it needs to do. And he's failing his classes and all kinds of things like that. But when we get down to it, he hates the classes that he's taking. He has absolutely no interest in them. He has all kinds of problems and issues going on with his home life and with his family and with his relationship. So he has all of these other things going on that have absolutely nothing to do with what he's really complaining about, which is, you know, he wants to be able to pass his class. Well, if you're not interested in the class, you don't have any motivation for it. If you have all this other, you know, every time you go home, there's arguments and fights and things like that. Well, it's no wonder that you're really having a hard time. And that has nothing to, the medication isn't going to fix that.
That's right. Yeah, if you're in a job that you don't like, if you're in an educational program you don't like, if you're in a relationship that's not working, you're going to have symptoms, but it may not be that you have a mental illness. It may be that you're struggling with some life issues, right? So there's a problem at the diagnostic level with just working with symptoms and that you might have the wrong diagnosis. But there are also problems at the intervention level. And that's a problem too. It's a problem with intervention. We talk about everybody wants to use evidence-based therapies. But even if you use an evidence-based therapy, everybody is familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It's evidence-based, so we want to use evidence-based therapies. But it doesn't matter if it's evidence-based if you're treating the wrong thing. If somebody makes an inaccurate diagnosis, it doesn't matter whether the therapy is evidence-based or not, it's not going to work. And we see this, especially with drug therapies, because people will often say, well, I tried medication, it's not working, it doesn't work.
Right.
In 2000, the National Institutes of Mental Health did a very large multi-site study. And what they wanted to know was if one antidepressant was more effective than the others. And when they did the study, they found out that none of them was very effective.
Right.
So even medications are not always effective. And then if you fast forward to 2018, there was a meta-analysis done. Meta-analysis is a study of studies. And there were 522 studies analyzed, and it found that there's only a modest effect with medication. So there's some reason why, whether they're medical interventions, drug interventions, or non-drug interventions, why so many of them are not effective. And we know that they're not effective, but it may be because we don't have the right diagnosis.
Absolutely. I think that's the, I think that what's going to come out is that that's the primary issue, is that, we're treating depressive symptoms, but medication isn't going to treat depressive symptoms. They treat depression, the mental health condition known as depression that has a biological root. They're not intended to treat, you're depressed because of this job situation that you're in right now. And, but you still go there every day.
Right.
They're not designed to treat that, because that's not depression. Those are symptoms. Those are responses or reactions to things that's going on in your environment. And I think that's going to be, it's the same thing we talk about all the time with ADHD in kids.
Right.
When you have kindergartners that are required to do book reports, and are learning multiplication, for goodness sakes, there's going to be some kids who aren't going to sit down and pay attention. But it's not because they don't have it's not because they have ADHD. It's because that's a ridiculous setting for those kindergartners to be in.
Yeah, you have famously said, and I've heard you when you're doing conferences and workshops, that if the lecture was being given in a language that you don't understand, Chinese or Russian, you're going to look like you're hyperactive because you're going to be distracted. You're going to be looking out the window. You might be walking around the room looking for something to do because you simply don't understand what's going on around you. Doesn't mean you have ADHD. It means that it's in a language that you don't understand. Okay. And so we need to be careful about jumping to a diagnostic conclusion. Medications don't treat job dissatisfaction. Medications don't treat learning disabilities or learning problems, and they don't treat boredom. So we need to be careful about the diagnosis. Now, the third problem, when we talk about diagnosis, we talk about medication. I like to think of diagnoses not being dichotomous. Do you have it or don't you have it?
Right.
Are you depressed? Are you not depressed? I like to think of them as there are serious mental illnesses, there are mild mental illnesses, and there are life problems. And if you think of mental health on a spectrum, the spectrum goes from serious mental illness to I got a life problem. I don't like my job. I don't like my house. I don't like the city where I'm living.
Yeah.
I hate the heat, but I live in Central Florida. Well, then move, go someplace where it's cool. Now, serious mental illnesses, and by serious mental illnesses, we're talking about things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Those sorts of illnesses probably respond and may require medication. I mean, it's pretty clear that if a person has schizophrenia and you give them a mood stabilizer, antipsychotic medication, that they get symptom relief and their life gets better.
Right.
Okay. Then there's mild mental illnesses. And I think that's where we're having our problems, is with mild mental illness and life problems. With mild mental illness like depression and anxiety, which are the two most common mental illnesses that we treat, symptom reduction may not equal therapy.
Right.
Okay, just because you're reducing the symptoms doesn't mean you're really doing therapy.
Right. Yeah, there was there were some interesting studies done not too terribly long ago where they were looking at depression, and they had two groups, the group that was getting the actual medication, and then they had another group that was getting a placebo. Right. Well, they started doing this third group, which was called a waitlist group. And what they did with that group was they enrolled them into the study, but they said, we'll just have to wait because there's too many people in the study right now. We'll get your baseline information, and then when a spot opens up in the study, then we'll enroll you. And so they did the baseline for this waitlist group, and then they assessed them again, a few weeks later, and they found that a large portion of those people got better. Their depression symptoms,
but nothing was done.
No medication, no nothing. And so within a couple of weeks, depressive symptoms tend to remit. They tend to alleviate, and because life circumstances change. And again, when we're talking about depressive symptoms, we're not necessarily talking about depression. And so now there's this whole idea that we really need to think about this waitlist group of people who, you just have to give them a little bit of time. Now, therapy is wonderful for that, because therapy is a way to, maybe even speed up that process. But, like you said, just because there's some symptom reduction doesn't mean that it's therapy. It could just be that, your life circumstances are changing enough to where those symptoms are starting to relieve.
Right. And, I think of anxiety. There are many treatments for anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy. We can treat your anxiety symptoms, but until we get to the root cause of your anxiety, that's what we have to get to, is what's creating the anxiety. I can reduce your symptoms, but isn't the goal to reduce the reason for your anxiety? Or we can reduce your depression symptoms, but how about the root cause of your depression? Where should we be going? But treating symptoms is much easier and cheaper than treating root causes. I mean, if I can give you a drug that takes away your depressive symptoms, I'm reducing your symptoms, but I'm making you better if I don't treat the cause of your depression. And so that becomes the difficult issue. And that's the problem with these mild mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. Then there's a third at the other end of the spectrum, are life problems, and what we have to be, I think what we as professionals have to be careful of is that we don't treat feelings as though they're symptoms.
Right.
I can have feelings of sadness. I can have feelings of depression. I can have feelings of anxiety, but it doesn't mean that I have a mental illness. It could just be that I have a life problem. The other thing about having these feelings is, do we want to quell them? Do we want to moderate our feelings? Because feelings motivate us to do something. If I'm feeling unhappy, if I'm feeling sad, if I'm feeling anxious, those things motivate me. We've done podcasts on that our emotions motivate us, to take action. And should we reduce people's feelings, because then we're taking away their motivation to do something about it. Okay. Right. So I think we need to be very careful and look very differently at severe mental illness versus mild mental illness versus life problems. And I think that's what we're responsible for.
Yeah.
Now there's this second issue of, do we have a societal problem?
Right. And that's the big thing, I think, that we have to decide.
Right.
We're not even really decide, but we just have to reconcile in our minds. Is it possible, or what can we do when looking at the individual amidst the societal issues?
Right.
One thing that's is a crude example, but it's a good example nonetheless, is that you can take your dog out of the pen and you can take it to the groomers and you can get it washed and cleaned and and treated and everything. But if you take it back home and you put it back in the same dirty pen that has fleas,
right,
it's going to get dirty and get the fleas again. It's
right.
just going to happen. And so you can treat the individual, but what do we do when it's the society that is having the sickness?
Right. That's right. If you have high rates of, for example, I think veterans are a good example. Okay. Veterans come back and many of them have difficulty, not all, but many veterans return and they're still struggling with issues. Well, if we've asked them to serve our country. Okay. Do we have an obligation to provide them with the best services? And I think we do. And are we doing that? apparently not, because there's very high suicide rates among veterans. So do veterans have a mental health issue? Yeah, but is it an individual problem, or is it a societal problem? And I think if we're asking people to put their lives on the line to get injured, whether it's emotionally or physically, that we then have, society has an obligation. What about the homeless? What about the elderly in our country? You know, you get old in the United States and you're in for some serious problems. Okay. Children with handicapping conditions. What about caregivers? You know, these people, these many, many millions of Americans who are taking care of family members, is that a societal problem, or is that just your tough luck? All right. I don't mean to be gross, but is it, well, I wouldn't even go there. But it's almost as though you wish the elderly would suddenly disappear so that nobody has to take care of them. Well, I'm sorry, the elderly are going to they're going to require lots of resources.
Right.
And that shouldn't be a family problem. That should be something that we as a society deal with. And we're not doing that. The underemployed, the unemployed, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, that creates anxiety.
Right.
Okay. So are we looking at individual mental health problems, or are we looking at societal problems that we ought to address as a society?
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that it's a good example. I think mentioning the unemployed and underemployed is important, because with most of these things that we're talking about as examples of, you know, whether it's being a caregiver or having kids with handicapping conditions and things like that, you know, it's remarkable how much easier it is to manage those things when you have the resources to manage those things.
Exactly. You know,
if you have the resources to hire a full-time nurse for your aging parents, to take care of them and to make sure that, you know, whatever health related issues they have going on is managed, well, that eliminates a ton of stress from you.
Right.
You don't care about them, and I certainly don't want it to be interpreted that way, but it's a very different kind of stress than when you're managing and you're providing the treatment on a daily basis.
That's right. And where does the individual responsibility and society say, hey, look, this is not your fault that right. you know, there are countries where if you have a child with Down syndrome, the government picks up the cost of that care. Okay. We don't do that in our country. Right. If you have an elderly adult with Alzheimer's and you can't afford $4,000 or $5,000 a month to put that person in a facility, then you're going to be dealing with that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know. And so is that a societal problem, or is that just a tough break for you as an individual? Okay. Right. And at some point, I think we're moving toward, maybe these are societal problems that we ought to be dealing with, like we deal with, like we dealt with cigarettes or right. Automobile safety. You know, is mental health, could it be that mental health problems are more of a societal problem than just an individual problem?
Right. And with that, and if that's the case, which I think that there is a fair argument that it is, that's when you start looking at public policy. Yeah, and exactly. You start looking at, you know, what are the systems in place to manage that. And the reality with that is that public policy changes are very slow. They take a long time to move and to change, and so, you know, we're left in this circumstance where, as these societal issues change very quickly, you know, life today is very different than it was in 2019, and that's just a couple of years. Right. You know, that's one presidential cycle. You know. Right. So we're leaving, you know, these public policy, these societal issues to be treated by the school system,
right,
or by the legal system,
the prison system, right?
Yeah. And so we're leaving these things to be managed by these systems that aren't intended to manage those systems in any way, but they're being held, and many times held responsible for managing them.
That's right. And that's what we've done by default, is we've said, well, we don't want to deal with these real issues at a societal level. So by default, prisons deal with it, public school systems, and families. You know,
Right.
if your child can't go to school, there's no other alternative. You have to keep that child at home and do the best you can.
Right.
And so those are problems that we could fix fairly quickly. They're not going to require massive public policy decisions. The other thing is, should we rely strictly on insurance to do this? You know, the insurance companies they're companies, they're for-profit companies. Should mental health be in the hands of for-profit companies?
Right.
Education in our country has always been, the government has assumed a responsibility for education. Should we assume responsibility for mental health care? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a question worth asking.
Yeah, I think that we really need to do a good sort of, as we started out this podcast, a good self-check and say, you know, here's what we're doing. How effective is it?
Right.
And are there better ways to do it? You know, we are now in a world of teletherapy. We are very much in a world of medication. You know,
Right.
are these things beneficial? And if they are, to whom are they beneficial, and to whom are they not beneficial?
Yeah, Bernie, that's one thing that you and I have talked about many times. Teletherapy, it's not either or. You know, let's not have teletherapy, or no, teletherapy works for a lot of people.
Right.
Well, let's use it for the people it works for, and not use it for the people it doesn't work for.
Right.
Okay.
But at the same time, there are people who need to be sitting on the couch.
Exactly. They need to be
in the office.
Exactly. And so we don't have to throw everything out. It doesn't have to be an either or. We have to, but I think we have to look at all these things. You know, who does medication works well for some people. So you don't want to get rid of medication. You don't want to get rid of drugs, but let's use it for the people who will benefit from it. Those are decisions that we can make today. We don't, that's not a public policy decision.
Absolutely. So we're certainly going to be talking about this more, because this is a big issue. And I think that there's sufficient research coming out to really support this idea that things are getting more concerning as it relates to our societal mental health and what's happening with that. And I think in many ways we are making a shift from, you know, there's a lot of focus on physical health related issues, you know, different illnesses. And I think that we are getting into an age where people are starting to recognize that mental illness is just as significant, just as serious, and just as big of a societal problem as measles.
That's right.
So we need to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think veterans are a perfect example. We do a very good job at prosthetic devices and physical therapy and the medical needs, but the mental health needs are just as significant, you know, and we're just not doing as good a job with the mental health needs as we are with the physical health needs.
Absolutely. So I think that's where we'll wrap it up for today, this week. We'll be back next week to talk about another topic.
Oh, yes, we do have a topic for next week, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
December 2nd, we have a special treat for everybody.
We do. We are we're going to interview someone. So it's going to be as long as we don't have to reschedule again. We had planned this a while back and we had to reschedule. So hopefully we'll be able to
I think that'll be an interesting interview next week. So please stay tuned. Join in.
It's a psychiatrist friend of ours, and we're going to talk about a new medication treatment. And so it'll be really interesting. So
yeah.
All right. So stay safe, everyone, during this holiday season, and don't go out and spend all of your money. Be mindful about what you're doing with all of that.
I keep forgetting that it's Black Friday.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
All right. So until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.